Hey YouTube, welcome to my channel if you're new here. Today we're going to be talking about 5 tips for beginner artists. We're going to be covering things like fundamentals, anatomy, atmospheric perspective, subject matter that's easier to draw versus more difficult. And I have books out here because I'm going to be using them for reference to talk about certain concepts. So hope you like the video. And yeah, let's get into it. So the first tip is to learn fundamentals. You want to learn things like anatomy, right? And you don't have to start out with very complicated things. You want to start out with the very basic shapes, of course, right? So things like this, where you are breaking down a face, the skull, into basic shapes instead of drawing very complicated stuff, right? You just start out with very basic drawing shapes and just making sure that you understand the way things are, just learning as much as possible, not about anatomy, especially the nose, right? A lot of people struggle with that. And then eventually you can go into more complicated matter where you can start drawing the skull, right? And then you move forward. But there's a progression, there's a learning curve to drawing, and you want to make sure that you start with the boring stuff so that you can learn the fundamentals. So then that way, when you draw the more complicated figures, right, you don't create a mess. And the same thing applies for color theory. I don't have a book on color theory, but you want to take the time to learn color theory as much as possible. And same thing with perspective, right? You want to learn perspective, 2D, 2-line perspective, 3, and you want to take the time to learn this as much as possible. So that way, when you do your own drawings, you're sticking to that learning curve and you're actually leveling up. So the second tip is you want to keep a sketchbook. And when I say this, I define sketchbook a little differently. I don't keep it as a as a gallery of some sort. It's more of a place where I'm learning and I put my thoughts on the page. Nothing is meant to be somewhat presentable. So here you can see this is an older sketchbook, by the way. I focused on learning, I drew bones, and I learned anatomy that way by drawing different bones, and you can learn how the hip bones for the male and the female are different, right? And you understand the shape, the angle, things like that. I don't have too many here. Yeah, keeping a sketchbook is important. You want to keep a sketchbook, and you don't have to, not everything has to be about learning, but just keep a sketchbook. Be consistent with your drawings, be consistent with your practice, right? There's no point in having a sketchbook and then you just don't draw in it. You want to continue to draw, otherwise you're not going to really be learning. And that actually goes to the third point, which is consistent practice. Whether you, there's no magic, there's no magic tool here. There's no magic tip that I can give you. The best thing to do is to just practice as much as possible. And you want to practice smart though, of course, right? So a theme you'll see here is learning, constant learning. So the third tip would be you have to learn as much as possible. You want to focus on practicing and drawing as much as possible. The more you draw, the better you'll be, right? So here, this is a good example. I'm focusing on learning, and I'm drawing the gestures of cats and things like that. And they're very basic, and it's not meant to be super accurate, right? The shapes, but you learn a lot this way. You learn about motion, you learn about gestures and things like that. Here, right? Like I said earlier, basic shapes, right? At the time I didn't really know too much about human anatomy, but I was able to dumb down the shapes into like very basic ones so that I can understand it. I can understand motion a lot more, right? And like I said earlier, like I'm willing to write in my sketchbook. It's not really an issue to me. Writing in my sketchbook is like the same thing as like just putting down my thoughts so that I'm learning more, right? Like motion, understanding how like, you know, things move in the body, right? This is all very important. So like you want to practice as much as possible. You want to learn as much as possible. So the fourth tip is to use references. You know, when you do your drawings, right, you want to make sure that you use references. Like, you know, you can draw. The reason why you should use references is because you haven't drawn something 10,000 times to be able to draw it from your imagination. Like most of us, you know, if you're watching this video, chances are, you know, you're looking for tips as well. So you're looking for tips. So I'm assuming that you're not a master at this, right? I'm assuming you're not a master. So you haven't drawn a single thing from memory 10,000 times. You haven't drawn a deer and you haven't drawn like different animals 10,000 times to be able to draw it from memory. That's the thing. So you have to use references. Otherwise, the drawing that you create, it's not going to look that great. You want to be able to, you know, use references so that way, you know, you're able to kind of create a good quality image. Drawing from imagination isn't always something that like leads to, you know, a good drawing. You want to make sure that you come up with something that's like, you know, that you're somewhat, you know, content with. Like especially when it comes to content that's like kind of not really in the real world. You haven't seen it in the real world at all for you to really visualize it. So for example, like, you know, if there's a tree, if you want to draw a tree, you've seen it at least millions of times, right, throughout your life. So like, sure, like that's something you might be able to draw from imagination. And by the way, like, you know, certain subject matter, they're easier to draw because of like, you know, margin of error and like because it's organic and like uses more, you know, like no straight lines and things like that. But the point is, like, you know, when it comes to like a lot of fantasy drawings, like these things don't exist in real life, right? So like, for example, like you're never gonna see something like this in real life. So oftentimes, like 99% of the time, people used reference photos to create things like this. Like this kind of creature doesn't exist in real life. So they had to like study anatomy of existing animals and then like, you know, like figure out how to, you know, create this kind of creature. You know, they had to use references for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't really look so good. And of course, the last tip that I have is to not really worry so much about like tools that you use. The tools that you use, you know, they don't really make you as an artist. Like I do have a lot of tools, and honestly, most of which I don't really use. Like I use a couple of like brushes for watercolor, obviously, right? There's brushes that I use, but most of the tools I use are like a pencil, you know, the eraser, right? And then like maybe like a couple, just like I have more micron. I have some more micron over here, but I'm not really showing it. But I'll use like I'll maybe use like the 005, right? The 1. I'll use a brush pen, right? And that's it. Like I only use 5 out of the ones that I have. Really, the tools don't really make the artist. So like, you know, don't really worry so much. And the same thing applies for like digital medium as well. I don't really think that like the brushes that people use for digital painting is as important as the practice and expertise that went into creating those digital paintings that you see on YouTube, right? But yeah, like that's the last tip. You know, tools don't really make the artist, so don't worry too much about them. But yeah, like keep drawing, guys. You know, keep learning. That's the most important thing. You want to keep learning, and yeah, hope you guys like the video. Like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and let me know what you guys think. Whatever kind of videos you guys want to see, just let me know, and I'll work on it. Thanks.